Hi, everyone. I apologize for the delayed start. I have a new laptop. I had a little logistical, technical issue getting on. Mike Makovsky, I'm President and CEO of JINSA. Thank you very much for joining us. We're fortunate to have General Chuck Wald, a distinguished fellow at JINSA for many years, and among other things, a former deputy U.S. European commander, and also air commander at CENTCOM, retired four-star Air Force general. And then we also have Ambassador Eric Edelman, uh, distinguished scholar at JINSA. And he does have a PhD, Chuck. And then he and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, former ambassador to Turkey, among many other government positions. So the reason why for the occasion of today's webinar is the release of our report that we just put out today, called Last Best Chance for Iran Strike. Now, and of course, another cause for today's webinar, coincidentally, is President Trump's announcement on Monday that the U.S. and the Iranians are going to meet, either directly or indirectly, we'll talk about that, this Saturday in Oman to see if they could reach some agreement on Iran's nuclear program. So let me just, Chuck, Eric, just give me a couple minutes. I just want to summarize a few points for the report we just put out, and then I want to ask both of you questions and so on. And we want to take, of course, any questions from the audience as usual. Look, the way the impetus of the report, what the issue we're trying to address is that now we wrote this before, of course, President Trump's announcement on Monday, but basically the issue we're addressing is, and what we raise in the paper is, given Iran's current weakness, as it's well known, what Israel has done pretty much decapitated Hezbollah, severely weakened Hamas. What the United States is now doing to the Houthis, Iranian proxies, Iran's position in the region has certainly been weakened. Israel also, in retaliation for Iranian strike in October, also knocked out for now Iran's advanced air defense system, the S-300s. They still have other air defense systems, but the more advanced ones, the S-300s, are now out of commission for now. There's also been domestic Iranian weakness, I'd say, in the regime. Certainly a lot of growing discontent, it seems like, inside, given, well, it's been building, obviously, that's been there for years, but even more recently, certainly with the fact that over the winter, a country like Iran, with one of the highest natural gas reserves in the world, cannot even provide sufficient heat to its people, has certainly caused a lot of consternation domestically. And then there's also this deadline of the snapback sanctions, which we could talk about, which the deadline is October, but the idea is for that it would take a few months to negotiate. So therefore, a deadline for those negotiations to commence among UN Security Council, U.S. Partners in the UN Security Council would maybe have to be resolved or commence in a few months. So given all those things going on, and of course the advancement of Iran's nuclear program, so much on the enrichment, has led us to believe that, and I think from my interactions and our interactions with the Israelis, them to think this is really a window to really address, I think, the next few months, Iran's nuclear program. militarily. And the president, of course, has called for these new talks. We're going to talk about that. Obviously, if this could be resolved and you could have a full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program diplomatically, that would be preferred. But if not, that it needs to be addressed militarily. And I'll add one last point that I also believe, or we also believe, I should say, that it's important for American deterrence and our posture in the region, particularly, I think, our credibility with the Chinese, that we be seen as keeping our commitments. And there's been maybe no more significant commitment over the last 25 years than by both presidents of both parties than in preventing nuclear Iran. So if Israel did attack, that it was important, we argue, that the United States preferably collaborate with Israel and at a minimum at least support them in certain ways. So I'll stop talking right now and I'll turn to Eric, Ambassador Edelman first to address this issue. And I think we'll want to also address, Eric, please, the issue that President Trump's announcement of talks this Saturday with the Iranians in Oman.
Well, it's certainly not something that we didn't anticipate when we wrote this report. You know, it was clear from previous statements that the president had made that he prefers a diplomatic solution, I think, as everybody would, to the problem of Iran's nuclear program, as opposed to the alternative, which he described in the Oval Office with.
And Eric, I'm sorry to interrupt, and we even put out a report the other month, about a couple months ago, laying out the way what should be the framework for negotiations
For
if
those
you so choose to
negotiations.
do that,
Right,
right? Yeah.
right. And point I was going to make is the president said the alternative was, as he put it in the Oval Office meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the obvious, which was obviously military action to deal with the program. Look, I think the way this was orchestrated is a little troubling to me. I mean, we know from press reports that even while Prime Minister Netanyahu was on the plane coming to Washington, it wasn't clear, what exactly the subject of the meeting was. In fact, a lot of the Israelis believed that the subject was going to be tariffs and possibly a tariff deal, since Israel had removed all tariffs on the United States, and nonetheless was, when the president announced the tariffs last week, subject to a 17% tariff. And so, in some sense, the prime minister was a little bit sandbagged by this announcement while he was in the Oval that this meeting was going to take place. Prime Minister Netanyahu made clear his desiderata for a negotiation, which is pretty close to what we had suggested in our report. He called for what he called a Libya-type solution, which is essentially the nuclear disarmament that Libya agreed to back in 2003 after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which enabled the United States to take over all the centrifuges, destroy them, so that Libya's nuclear program was no more. Now, I should point out that when then National Security Advisor John Bolton recommended to President Trump in his first term that the Libya model be used for President Trump's negotiations with North Korea, President Trump was very impatient with Bolton. In fact, this issue was one of the ones that led to the estrangement of Bolton and Trump, and Bolton's ultimate departure from the administration in the the fall of 2019. So I worry a bit about how this negotiation has been, set up to begin with. The other thing I would say that is notable is we've seen a number of statements from President Pezeshkian of Iran that suggest that the Iranians have been getting a bit of coaching about how to deal with Stephen Witkoff, the president's envoy, from our Russian friends. It's not an accident, comrades, that Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the one of the negotiators that Putin has appointed, and probably the most important, more important than Foreign Minister Lavrov and National Security Advisor, Diplomatic Advisor, former U.S. Ambassador to the U.S., Yuri Ushakov. Dmitriev is extremely close to Putin. His wife is schoolmate of Putin's daughter. He is U.S. educated, Stanford, Harvard Business School, Goldman Sachs, speaks very good English, and he has been very, very good at manipulating Witkoff by promising Witkoff, if there's normalization of U.S.-Russia ties and end to the ceasefire in Ukraine, that there'll be all these wonderful business deals that the U.S. can do with Russia. It's not, again, as I would say, an accident that Pezeshkian in his recent statements has been touting the prospects of U.S. investment in Iran and business deals to be done if negotiations can lead to some kind of agreement. I think they're being coached in how to approach the administration. We in a previous webinar we had Elliot Abrams, former envoy for Iran in the first Trump administration, expressed concerns, which I share, that Steve Witkoff, who is now negotiating Gaza ceasefire, negotiating a Ukraine ceasefire, now in charge of this Iran negotiation, that's a lot on anybody's plate.
Yeah.
And in particular, the meeting on Saturday, which will take place in Oman, will be with Foreign Minister Araghchi of Iran, who is deeply knowledgeable about all of these issues. He was, then Foreign Minister Zarif's deputy in the negotiations that led to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under the Obama administration. He knows this stuff inside and out, and I'm a little worried that Steve Witkoff may not have a lot of time to master a brief about very complicated set of subjects having to do with centrifuges, which models of centrifuge, how much LEU, enriched to 60%. So, the unnamed members of the administration who were involved in this have said, we're not going to be played for suckers. I hope that's right. I hope they don't let themselves get roped into an endless negotiation with the Iranians. But we shouldn't forget that these are the people who invented chess. And so we ought to be very, very mindful of that. And I would say, with some concern. Now, I will say one other thing in defense of the administration. Administration is moving lots of military assets into the region. We've had a number of B-2s sent to Diego Garcia. We've had some tankers that have just been sent, THAAD batteries to Israel, another carrier battle group headed towards the Gulf. Presumably that is part of a strategy of coercive diplomacy to try and get a deal with Iran. But I hope they're also there in case the diplomacy fails, and that there's a pretty short timeline for this diplomacy, as you were suggesting, Mike, in your opening comments, that they're there to be able to support Israel in whatever military action Israel deems necessary, if that's what it comes to.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Eric. There's a lot to follow up, but let me go to Chuck. General Wald, let me pick up on one last point that Eric just raised, and I don't think it gets enough attention. If you wouldn't mind explaining it for everybody here, is what assets we've put out there in the region, and basically how many soldiers that involves, and how long we could maintain that. I think correct me if I'm wrong, we have one carrier there now. Another carrier there, I think, is arriving next week, I think. We have some destroyers and so on. And as Eric mentioned, we have these B-2s. I think it's at least 5. if you don't mind just first addressing that, I think that doesn't get really explained. There's been this big buildup. You've seen reports. They brought also patriots from, I think, South Korea. Anyway, I think if you don't mind painting the picture about our force posture there in the region now, I think it would be useful, Chuck. Thank you.
Yeah, there are 6 B-2s at Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is the place where when we first attacked Afghanistan after the 9/11 attack on the United States, the B-2s flew out of Missouri nonstop to Afghanistan and then landed at Diego Garcia. That was a 44-hour mission. The ones that are there now, there's 6 again. We had 6 that attacked Afghanistan, ironically, on the first night of October 7th, 2001. And all 6 of those, they came in pairs of 2s, and all of them dropped 22,000-pound bombs each. So that's 122,000-pound bombs on the first night, first strike. So they're there. Diego Garcia is about just about the same distance from Tehran as from the east coast of the United States to the west coast. So it'd be about 2,500 to 3,000 miles or so. And that's a very doable type mission for a B-2. That would be about a 16-hour round trip mission. Like I said, the first one in Afghanistan was 44 hours. Then there's the 2 carriers. The Carl Vinson is on his way. And those 2 carriers carry a massive amount of firepower, both from ground launched cruise missiles, TLAMs they're called, tactical land attack missiles, as well as fighter aircraft, F-35s, etc. And those are all very capable, and they have some of their own air refueling capacity on board there to a minimum. And then the THAAD is something that's really, it's almost the equivalency of an Arrow, which the Israelis have. Very, very capable Cedar high altitude air defense missile. And the Patriot, that deploy to Israel routinely, as you know, during Juniper Falcon. And they come out of Europe. And then there'll be other assets as well, the KC-46s that are going to be deployed there that we've been advocating that Israel gets all along, and other tankers. And there'll be other assets as well, space assets, but there are a lot of intelligence assets. There are going to be a lot of drone type assets and a lot of ground and air launched cruise missile type assets. The military capability will have on their fighters, but the Israelis can carry up to about 5,000-pound bunker penetrating bombs, and then the B-2s can carry some pretty good capable ordnance as well for penetration and with GPS. So I think one of the questions people would have is some of these targets are buried, Porto and others, under a couple hundred feet of dirt or concrete. But we did this in Bosnia, as a matter of fact, back in the mid-90s when we went after a bunkered air defense missile and aircraft bunker in Croatia. And it was buried under a mountain deep. And what they did is they kept bombing this target with very accurate bombs. These things they land within 5 to 10 feet of the target. You keep doing that, and you can start penetrating through the hardened buried target. So, U.S. and kind of alluded to it at the beginning. How long can these assets stay there? They can stay there as long as we want.
Yeah.
There's nobody's going to want to stay out there 5 years. But the date working backwards is October 18th. That's the date. And so I think we got about between here and there before we have to do something because of the snapback.
You think we could keep 2 carriers in the Mideast for a few months? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we do it all the time, frankly. They go up for about months at a time. But we could keep those carriers there forever. Now, it's not ideal. They have families and everything else, but the reality is that there's no physical limitation on that.
And by the way, how many carriers are operating on the seas at one time?
There's usually have 11 carriers, and they usually have about 3 or 4 out, 5 out at a time.
At a time,
but 3 mostly.
but it's a pretty significant commitment to keep 2 there out of that, and then
yeah, it is. I mean, we've done that before. I think it's wise to do that for a lot of reasons. Let the Houthis keep turn around, and we need capability there. You can't put it past the B-2s bombing Yemen either, for that matter. But
Yeah, right. Using
I mean,
B2s.
and people are, when it comes to this, you don't worry about timelines anymore. This is a mission that has to be done, and I don't think anybody should doubt that they'll be there as long as they have to.
By the way, let me pick up on what with Eric, what General Wall just said about discuss about the military posture. It seemed to me, Eric, there'd be three possible reasons why we're putting these out. One is a way to pressure the Iranians, or two, to participate or support an Israeli strike. Maybe some of these forces are being used, as Chuck just mentioned, for hitting the Houthis. But how do you interpret this these movement of assets and yeah? And by the way, what does it say that we have to move patriots from South Korea to the Middle East? Does that mean we don't have enough patriots right now? Um,
I think it was that actually that we moved
oh, it
to
was Thad's.
Israel. Yeah, I think it
I
was
thought it
that.
was both, but okay,
I
maybe.
mean, look, yes, we don't have enough, air defense assets, given the global stresses now that we face, um, whether it's on the Korean Peninsula, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. We've expended a lot of Patriot interceptors, both in supporting Ukraine, supporting Israel in April and October. Um, One of the challenges we face is that our defense industrial base has real issues, sort of maintaining the supply of interceptors. I mean, Chuck will know better than I, but I think that the production rate until the last year or so has been something like 300 a year. So it takes a while to replenish these assets. And I know that the Department of Defense is trying to step up the production rate, get the defense industry to step up the production rate, but that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for industry because it requires investment in plant capacity, additional floor space, taking on a very highly skilled workforce, well, recruiting first of all, and then maintaining a very highly skilled workforce. And industry doesn't want to do that if they think this is just going to be a temporary blip and then the demand signal is going to go down. They want to know that there's going to be a steady rate of demand from the Department of Defense for production of these interceptors. Now, I mean, if you look at the world and you look at what we're up against, I mean, one can imagine that there would be a pretty steady demand, but they've got to see that in action from authorizers and appropriators, and we've got issues having to do with CRs that make it force the Department of Defense to operate at the level of the last year's appropriations, and we may get some relief from that. The Secretary of Defense was hinting with President Trump the other day that the budget's going to go up to $1 trillion, which I would applaud. But we haven't seen it yet. So, and I think industry hasn't seen it yet. So that limits its impact on production rates. As to why it's there, as I said in my earlier comments, Mike, I think this is an effort at least in the first instance at coercive diplomacy, and to powerfully concentrate the minds of the Iranians. So you mentioned in your remarks, Mike, that Israelis' destruction of the command and control of Hezbollah, the fact that Hamas is not an organized military force anymore, the attacks the administration has leveled against the Houthis. I would add to that the popular mobilization forces, the Shia militias in Iraq, have suggested that they are prepared to fold themselves into the Iraqi national army, which is a good sign, but it also indicates they're not looking for a fight with either Israel or the United States right now. And the other, of course, important proxy, Syria, that regime has now completely gone away. it is one of the reasons why we in our report have said this is probably the optimal moment for military action against Iran's nuclear program, assuming that you can't get to a diplomatic solution, which I think all of us are skeptical about.
Let me ask you, Eric, go just talk about the last couple of days. I mean, how do you, first of all, how do you see the fact that reports are that, at least what I've read, maybe you've read others, that Netanyahu learned about the White House decision to start these talks only like a couple hours before I think they went in front of the cameras, and then that would
Yeah,
be one.
it was Witkoff in his meeting before the meeting in the Oval at Blair House where Prime Minister Netanyahu learned of this, as I understand it.
And then I guess, what are we going to look for on Saturday? I mean, it's hard to imagine the Iranians are just going to say, you know what, you're right. Just let's just dismantle everything. So that it's hard to imagine that they're going to say that on Saturday at least. What should we look for, and how many? And we also in our previous report said there had to be a limited amount of time. And in fairness, President Trump correctly put in his letter, apparently, to the Iranian supreme leader that I think he said 2 months. But how long would you give these talks, and what would we want to see? Is it realistic to see any Iranian concessions early? And then, I guess part of this for this long question is, I guess what I'm really getting at is how, uh, if you were involved in these talks, at what point would you just say, Mr. President, this isn't happening or something,
Yeah.
and then.
Well, I'm sorry to say, Mike, that as someone who spent 30 years in the U.S. Foreign
Yeah,
Service,
they're never going to say that, is
my
that?
my my observation about negotiators is that they are loath to tell the president that they failed and that they haven't been able to get a deal.
Right.
And so it becomes very easy to to get roped into a very long, extended negotiation. Now, as you say, President has allegedly said, short time period. I mentioned the statements that others have made off the record or on background that, they're not going to be played for fools and that want something quick. I would commend to people the Lawrence Norman article in this morning's Wall Street Journal that talks about the difficulty of actually accomplishing this now. This is a way more difficult issue to resolve than it was for the Obama folks negotiating this in 2013 to 2015, because Iran has progressed so far. They've got much more modern centrifuges for uranium enrichment that produce uranium at much higher levels of enrichment much more quickly. They've got a lot of know-how that they've gained over the last several years of these enrichment operations. They've continued, presumably, the work that the Israelis have already exposed by their exfiltration of the Fakhrizadeh archive of weaponization activities. And as Norman points out, we've never gotten one of the signal failures of the JCPOA was the failure to get a full declaration from the Iranians of all their weaponization activity, which makes it very hard to verify anything that you're negotiating with them because you don't know what the baseline is for what it is that they've accomplished. So this is going to be very, very difficult. I mean, unless the Iranians are willing, certainly in the first instance, to blend down all of their HEU at 60% to something much lower, to get rid of that that uranium, and then get serious about restricting the amount of enrichment activity that they're entitled to. I mean, my preference would be zero. I don't think they should have any enrichment capability. But I'm not sure you could get an agreement with that at this point because they've gone so far. So some of this is going to depend on the administration's tolerance for, some level of, uranium enrichment by Iran. And once you start getting into that, then you're off to the races. A very long, complicated negotiation.
Okay. By the way, Chuck, I wanted to ask you, someone has asked a question already. I'll just read it. It says, Jonathan Nemeth, could Iran agree to a nuclear deal and then buy North Korea or other sources, nuclear assets? I guess buy basically a bomb from the North Koreans. Wouldn't that be easier than just? But of course, at this point, they're pretty close as it is with their enrichment. But I don't know if you want to address it.
Well, he's articulated it way better than I could, but I mean, and the package uh, got a nuclear weapon surreptitiously in the past. They bought the capability. And I've always worried that we've talked about this in our meetings, that people say, well, they have to then develop a delivery methodology, or they have to develop the actual ability to put this nuclear weapon, this Iranian, into a nuclear weapon that they can deliver. And my point is, they can buy that capability from North Korea, for example. So I think once they've gone down the path where they have access to the nuclear material and the technology to put things on weapons, however that is, it's over. And so my feeling, I've said this all along, I must sound like I'm kind of a hawk here or something. It's not the point. Is any country that starts their meetings off or not mine, and
Mine either.
they are hell bent on destroying Israel, and you can understand it better than I ever would, Mike, and I'm sure the ambassador does. But most people don't even imagine a country thinking that way. They do think that way. You have to believe they are. And I think the fact that they've gone this far down the path, I like this coercive diplomacy issue. That's really a big point. But you have to have the hammer behind it to make that credible. And they have got to believe that unless they do a genuine, good faith negotiation where they have IAEA people that are actually going in there and verifying, they need to understand that it's not going to be tolerated.
Chuck, let me ask you just for the Iranian understanding is how have you assessed, well, not directly related, it seems to have implications for Iran. Certainly President Trump is how will you assess what the U.S. military has been doing to the Houthis recently?
I assess it as a very good signal and very credible. I mean, there's the issue about the signal. I get that. Forget that. That's policy decision. But from the standpoint of the actual attack, I think they're very good. I think it's excellent. I think it's actually taught the U.S. and the Israelis some things about deep and hardened buried targets a little bit, because some of that is that way. And that this isn't the, I think one of the fallacies that people have had about the retaliation in Iran against their nuclear capabilities, it's a one-time strike. This is not going to be a one-time strike.
Yeah.
This has to be a revisit. It's going to have to be a campaign from the standpoint of taking out the air defenses that are left, from the standpoint of hitting other military targets, command and control, intel. And I think once you start on this thing, you've got to keep going. It isn't just kind of a pinprick once in a while type thing. You've got to go after their nuclear capability and their ability to expand their mission out into Israel again with their missiles and things. You got to be ready for that. You got to develop a integrated air defense capability in the Middle East. You got to defend Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Jordan and others. So once this starts, it's going to go for a while, but they have to go and destroy Iran's capability to extend the threat into Israel or into the Middle East once they start.
Mike, if I could, I just wanted to add one thing to what General Wall just said, though, because I think it's important. What he didn't say was as important as what he said, which is this is not, however, going to look like Iraq 2003, 2.0, because this is not going to be, a land invasion with the 4th Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Infantry Division, all these other units going in a ground campaign to conquer Iran and impose regime change by military means. This is a very different military operation, and I think that's important because there are a lot of people who are trying to suggest that that's exactly what this is. This is just going to be another endless war in the Middle East with the United States occupying another Muslim country, et cetera. That's not what I think anybody's talking about.
I just want to go back to the talks and Ambassador Edelman, you mentioned, of course, no negotiator wants to emit failure or lack of success, so they keep going back and back. Um, Again, how much we're going to read about this? I don't know. They'll make some statements. We'll see whether positive vibe, some, and it may be, I guess, at what point, will we say, look, this isn't working? Do we want to see that maybe not on the first session, but at the next one, there has to be meaningful concessions by the Iranians? And if there aren't, it just means like they're going to be running out the clock. What do you think is realistic given that the president has embarked on this path right now?
Mike, do you mean what do you think we, at JINSA
Yeah, like what do we
say,
want to be?
or what will Steve Witkoff say? Because
Well, that's a good question. Those are two different things, I assume. That's very
they're two
possible. But
different things. Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, I guess at least for those of us on the outside, what do we want to be seen to assess us, not, the negotiator? What would we say? Okay, they're making progress, or it doesn't seem like there's enough progress. Maybe the Iranians make some concessions, but obviously, from our standpoint, we want complete dismantlement. And the Israelis have indicated that's what they want to see, and they obviously will have a say here. At least they'll have a say in how they react. I don't know. I guess what are we going to be?
But it's hard to hard to know because I mean, if you look at both the Gaza ceasefire negotiations and the Ukraine negotiations, in which Steve Witkoff has been involved so far, what's very striking is the readouts are very vague of all of them. They're always constructive and progress is being made, but there's never any explanation of in detail what is why is it constructive and what has been discussed, and that's in some sense at variance. There were a lot of very detailed readouts during the 2013 2015 JCPOA negotiations, which, even though a lot of things weren't revealed until the final document came out, but you could get a sense of where it was headed because, you knew that the administration was giving ground, for instance, on the number of centrifuges because you had an interim agreement that had a specific number of centrifuges. You knew how many centrifuges they were putting in because you were getting those numbers from from the IAEA reports. So there was a way to sort of measure it. The IAEA reports now are much less detailed by design as a result of the JCPOA. So I think it's going to be a lot harder for outsiders to to measure progress or lack thereof in these negotiations than was the case a decade ago.
Okay.
Like, make
Yeah, go
one
ahead,
comment.
please.
First of all, I'd never tried to out negotiate Ambassador Edelman. He's got it, but I almost look at it like a mandatory step to say we're going to have negotiations because of a lot of reasons, the international community, etc. But I don't put a lot of faith in the fact that we're going to be able to negotiate an agreement because they never do.
Yeah.
And it's almost it's not international law, but it's in our ethos that we're going to try to negotiate. But I don't think it's going to work. And I think and unless Iran really believes we're going to go after them, you'll never get any progress. And I think they're gutsy enough to say we'll call your bluff.
Yeah. And let me follow up to both of you on this. One of the things, obviously, the JCPOA did not address, which is Iran's missiles development. And I guess, look, a lot of the focus of ours and others had been obviously on the enrichment, the question of where they are on weaponization and so on. But let me just throw out something. Would maybe there's a rhetorical question. I'll start with you, Eric. If we don't if these talks don't address Iran's missile development, because obviously for the United States, one of our big concerns has to be whether they could develop missiles that could reach the eastern seaboard of the United States. Would those be seen as successful talks?
Well, not in my view. I mean, you're right. I mean, one of the major failures of the JCPOA was to address the ballistic missile program. Um, it's the largest, you know, ballistic missile program any nation state has ever built that doesn't have nuclear weapons. You know, which begs the question of why they're doing it. Now, we've seen a lot of these missiles used in the two attacks on Israel in April and October of last year. The Israelis, with a lot of help from their friends, including us, were able to more or less, defeat those attacks. But those were attacks with conventional warheads on those weapons, not a nuclear warhead. When you start talking about nuclear warheads, the defense dilemma becomes a lot different. So look, the Iranians have already shown through their space launch capability that they've mastered the ability to stage missiles that could have intercontinental reach. They haven't tested one at intercontinental range yet, but they've mastered the fundamental technology. So to me, it's only a matter of time before they get there.
Yeah.
Let me add.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think the ambassador's right again. I think one of the things to look at on this, or the perspective, is it's not just destroying the nuclear capacity for Iran. You have to get the missiles. You have to worry about their capacity to attack U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf, if you will, because they've done that before. We're going to have to address that. All these things are going to happen. And I think the ambassador made a great point. This is not going to be Iraq. We're not going to do a ground invasion or anything like that. But it will be a more than one-time air attack. Matter of fact, multiple air attacks in various ways on various targets, to include. And by the way, this nuclear capability, delivery capability, has a whole bunch of parts to it. The delivery mechanisms have to go, because once this starts, the Iranians are going to do everything they can to attack Israel in any way they possibly can, or U.S. assets, or other Gulfies. We're going to have to do a broad targeting campaign that's over several days, maybe weeks. And we're going to have to set up the defenses, because this thing, they will try to retaliate some way to save face, if nothing else, hurt the enemy in this case. So it's going to be a broad go for it over time, lots of assets, lots of targets, lots of different mediums, missile development, naval attacks in the Persian Gulf, if you will, and then getting the centrifuges. And by the way, the centrifuges are not just dependent on just building the enriched uranium. There's other parts of the command and control and other delivery mechanisms we have to go after. This could be broad. I think the negotiations need to have a cutoff date. I think, just like the ambassador said, a couple of months, we got to get ready. And we got to really start moving in assets into the Middle East big time. I mean, we talked about some of it already. I'm talking about munitions and other types of air defense weapons big time.
Okay, thanks, Chuck, on that. All right, I just want any concluding comments, Eric, first, and then General Walden.
Well, the previous administration, when it started its indirect negotiations with Iran, kept repeating that time is running out. We don't have endless amount of time for these negotiations, and yet they let them drag on for almost 2 years without any result, and then came to the conclusion that there was no military solution to the problem. There was only a diplomatic solution, but they had no diplomatic game plan for how to get there. I think we really are now at the point where the sands of time are really slipping through the hourglass fast, because the danger here is that if we delay, if we dawdle, we will not only lose the ability to snap back the sanctions, which will then become very contentious among allies, particularly if we're right now we're in a pause of the trade war, but if we get back into a trade war, including with our European allies, that could have an impact on the discussions over snapback. But we will also get to the point where the Iranians, if they don't, break out, will creep out and have enough of a nuclear capability that the conversation changes dramatically, and it becomes very hard to deal with, as we've discovered with North Korea. I mean, it's much harder to try and negotiate an end to this or end the program once they have nuclear weapons than it is before. And although military action has a lot of downsides to it, and nobody wants to do it if we don't have to, the alternative is they get a nuclear weapon. And this one, I think, is worse than North Korea's, because I think this one is the end of the nonproliferation regime. It will lead to a cascade of other nuclear weapon states in the region. And we will be in the midst of a world that's much more dangerous for Israel, much more dangerous for the Middle East, and much more dangerous for the United States.
Any predictions on these talks, Eric? Or is that not fair?
I predict that the talks in Oman on Saturday will be very constructive and fruitful.
Okay.
At least that's the way they will be characterized by both sides afterwards.
Okay. Right. Chuck, any concluding comments?
Yeah, I think again, militarily, we have to be ready. I mean, it's going to be a diplomacy. It's going to be politicians that decide to do this or not. But the Iranians have to realize that we are serious about not allowing this to happen, and we'll take military means to do that. And again, this is a personal observation, but we can't treat the Iranians the way we wish they were. We have to treat them the way they are. We can't treat them the way we would be. We have to treat them the way they are. I have very little faith that the negotiations are going to work, and I have a real high probability in my mind that we're going to have to do something militarily. I prefer not to. It's not my decision. But I think they have to realize this is as serious as it gets. It's not going to be allowed to happen.
Look, thank you. I want to just add, I encourage everyone to read the report that we just put out on this. And I didn't mention in my opening comments, but I want to make sure people understand one of the themes we mentioned in this report and in previous one is that there should be no daylight between Israel and the United States on this. I think that, by the way, just the Israelis, I just throw this out. If they see talks not going in the right direction, it's possible they would just choose to act. Now, they would rather make sure to do this, obviously. Now, whether you would think they would want to do this in some coordination with the United States, they certainly want certain U.S. support and would rather have collaboration. But I think the stakes are very high right now, obviously, for Israel. They see it this way. Don't forget, I think the Israelis feel after October 7th, they have an account that they need to that they need to address with the Iranians that's been open. The Iranians supported obviously all these attacks on Israel. The Hamas they supported, even if they didn't know the actual day of attack. They were giving Hamas a lot of support. Hezbollah was their closest proxy. Israel had a war of attrition with Hezbollah for almost a year before Israel really decapitated them. That organization. So I think there's an account open for the Israelis with the Iranians. And I think the Israelis also see things differently than before October 7th, that you can't wait till it's the very last moment to do something. I think they have a sense much more of preemption than they had, obviously. I think before October 7th, their attitude towards the Iran nuclear program was, we'll have to do something when tomorrow is too late. But I don't think that's how they see it that way anymore. So I think the stakes are very high for Israel. They see this as an opportunity, and I think, as we write, I think we hope that the United States and Israel are lockstep on this issue. So please read that report that we just put out today. I also want to thank everybody for joining. I also want to wish everyone who is celebrating Passover a happy Passover. And we will probably have another webinar next week about something else. But for those celebrating Easter, I wish everybody a happy holiday for that as well. So thank you very much for joining. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Chuck, for today, for being with us. Okay, bye.